You want answers?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
You want answers?
You have offended my family.
I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth.
And you have offended a Shaolin temple.
You can't handle the truth.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Radical Rant.
Well, today I'm going to dive headfirst into the controversy going on up in Washington State. As you know, I-502 passed and legalized recreational marijuana, but now the Washington State Liquor Control Board has recommended doing away with home grow, reducing patient limits, creating a patient registry, and moving most patients into the recreational system. This has prompted Steph, Sherer, the executive director of Americans for Safe Access, the nation's leading medical marijuana only group, to write an op-ed entitled, "Don't Treat Medical Marijuana Patients Like Recreational Users." Before I get too deep into this, let me start with a disclaimer in that I support medical marijuana. I've supported and voted for every single medical marijuana bill that has ever come across. I have campaigned for it. I know the science behind it. I have interviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have gained medical benefit from the use of cannabis. So it's not to deny or disparage any of that. However, I do want to talk a little bit about the framing and the rhetoric that we use regarding the defense of medical marijuana, if you will, and how some of these tactics that worked well in the late 90s are wearing thin in the 2010s. So with that in mind, let me get to some of the quotes here from Steph, who, by the way, I respect the hell out of Steph Sherer. She's done amazing work, but still, I got to address some of this stuff. She writes, "Some in Washington have suggested that patients who enjoy the protections of the current program don't really need it, that they can get their needs met within a recreational retail model." Okay. Now, this is a little bit of distortion. Some in Washington have suggested that patients who enjoy the protections of the current program don't need it. No, I think people are suggesting that some of the people who are enjoying those current protections could get by just fine with the I-502. Some of them. Not all patients, but again, we'll address that in a second. She continues, "But that ignores the challenges facing those with the most serious medical conditions, denies what works in the state's medical cannabis program, and overlooks the strengths of previous legislation." Well, the challenges facing those with the most serious medical conditions right there sets us in the point that I'm trying to make, is that not every single patient in Washington State has the challenges for those with the most serious medical conditions. Yes, there are the medical marijuana patients who have Crohn's disease or epilepsy or intractable pain or incurable nausea or cancer, or AIDS, whatever it might be. Not denying that at all. But it is a non-zero number of some of these patients who don't have those. Some of these patients that are skating by. Some of these patients who got a recommendation to treat their arrest anxiety syndrome and are merely enjoying the medical marijuana protections to protect what the rest of us are doing with marijuana, and that's just getting high. Yes, I know there is the desperately ill cancer patient, just as well as I have seen with my own two eyes at HempFest a stream of 20-something young men walking into a tent to get a recommendation from a naturopath for $40, strapping on the gas mask bong before they go out to headbang to the Cottonmouth Kings. And I think what some people are suggesting is maybe those guys ought to be on the recreational program, on the I-502 program. Maybe those guys ought to be paying some taxes. I think that's what people are saying. Now, Steph does a very good job here of pointing out that there was a chance of putting together regulations for dispensaries and to better have tighter regulations for medical marijuana in Washington State. This was that Senate Bill 5073 back in 2011 that had a lot of the controls in it that the Department of Justice wants, right? That, don't have diversion, have it well regulated and so on. Those, of course, got line item vetoed by Gregoire when she was afraid because the U.S. attorneys made the threats that they were going to come bust all these people and so forth. Yes, those facts are incontrovertible. But it's also incontrovertible that a lot of people in the medical marijuana industry up there in Washington State fought tooth and nail against SB 5073 and fought all attempts previous to that to have any sort of regulation in the system. You get to the point where you got people that go to such hyperbolic lengths as to claim that having a medical marijuana registry would be like having a sex offender registry. Yeah, they're exactly the same, because one would be patients registering on a private database with the state in order to be protected from arrest, and the other would be perverts on a public database that can be searched by anybody for harassment and scorn. But other than that, they're exactly the same. Seems to have worked in 16 other states, but God forbid we institute that in Washington and protect patients from actual arrest. And maybe, just maybe, if there were a registry and some effort by the medical marijuana community to more strictly regulate the access to this medical marijuana, so it was indeed just the sickest and most disabled patients, they wouldn't be in the rhetorical corner they've painted themselves in now, having to fight off the advances of recreational marijuana. Now, Steph does go forth to say the Washington State Liquor Control Board is finalizing its recommendations for the legislature. A sensible bill will establish a tightly regulated system of separate local distribution so patients can get the types of cannabis that work for their specific conditions and freely exchange information about therapeutic use. The state should protect personal cultivation that enables access for the most needy. Right. I think everyone's in agreement there that the medical program that exists in Washington State should protect the most needy. The problem I've got is this continued presupposition in this argument that every patient meets the greatest outlier of medical marijuana. In the quote that really got me, she says, lawmakers will have to see past misinformation. She basically says that, they should just dust off Senate Bill 5073, put it back to the legislature and get that passed. And that's a great idea. And I think it would be a smart idea to negotiate for, say, hey, let's have a moratorium on closing any of the existing dispensaries until we can get that 5073 through and signed, right? Let's maybe negotiate for something like that. Oh, imagine negotiating. But anyway, the quote here is, the panel will have to see past the misinformation that always circulates around this issue. That misinformation includes claims that 95% of patients don't really have treatable medical conditions, despite their doctor's determination otherwise. Well, again, we're getting into some Weasley word territory. We're not saying that patients don't have treatable medical conditions. My anxiety is a treatable medical condition. My hangnail is a treatable medical condition. My backache's a treatable medical condition. The question is how many of them are the really seriously ill patients that are the ones that without 15 plants and 24 ounces, they will die. And I'm sorry, it's not 95% of them. It's not 80% of them. It's not 20% of them. I know this. You cannot fool me. I have worked in these medical marijuana clinics. I've been behind the scenes. I've worked with the patient advocacy organizations as we got people their medical marijuana cards. And frankly, this move to rush the sickest and most disabled person to the front of the line and claim that is representative of every single medical marijuana patient is wearing a little thin. Steph goes on, ask the patients who've done better because they've had cannabis to bolster their battles with cancer, AIDS, or chronic pain. Right, we don't disagree on that. Cancer, AIDS, chronic pain, neuropathic pain, epilepsy, Crohn's disease, etc., etc., etc. Yes, absolutely. But to pretend that is 100% of the medical marijuana patients in Washington State is disingenuous. We've been to the same events. We've seen the same backstages. We know this. Now, not just my opinion on this, because I want the patients, the really sick patients, to have these protections. And my fear here is this continued reliance on this hyperbolic rhetoric that presupposes that everybody is the worst case patient, causes the people we're negotiating with and the people we're trying to convince to call bullshit in their minds. And then we risk losing all these possible protections for every patient. This might be the time to recognize which battles you can win and which battles you should be fighting. And in this case, I think the cancer patient, the AIDS patient, the people who actually really do need 15 plants and 24 ounces, you ought to start figuring some way to protect them by realizing that some of these other people would be fine with 3 ounces. Would be fine if they didn't have home grow. It would be inconvenient. It would cost them more money. Yes, that would suck. But are you going to fight for their right to have the 24 ounces and lose the 24 ounces for everybody and the cancer patients too? seems to me that we're still fighting this medical marijuana battle if it's 1996 here, and that we're having to convince people that marijuana is okay. And they've just legalized it in Washington state. We don't have to make that fight anymore. To confirm, there was a poll that came out, CBS News. This was, I believe, a couple years ago. It had 77% support nationwide for medical cannabis. Do you think doctors should be allowed to prescribe medical marijuana? And this is 77% support. But in that same poll, only 31% of the country believes marijuana that is purchased in this country through state-authorized medical marijuana programs is being used to alleviate suffering from serious medical illnesses. End quote. Majorities of Republicans and independents and a plurality of Democrats believe, quote, most of it is being used for other reasons, end quote. So, make a good faith effort, patients. Negotiate for the most sick of you to continue with the protections you've got. Realize that a lot of you could do with lesser amounts, and that some of you are really just recreational patients like me, recreational users like me, who are trying to fig leaf your shame over getting high with some sort of all uses medical bullshit.
This is the Russ Belville Show. The Russ Belville Show is blogging and podcasting daily at radicalruss.com.
That's all the time we got for today. You can call in live in hour 2 here if you want to give me a piece of your mind. The phone number is 971-533-7111. I'm Radical Russ. Until next time, take care of each other, tokers.